Hello, everyone. Welcome to Consumer Action's 52nd anniversary virtual convening. The theme for this year's anniversary is a celebration of service. And in keeping with that theme, the topic for the webinar today is Serving Generation Z, Post-COVID Challenges and Practical Solutions. My name is Nelson Santiago. I am a Community Outreach Manager with Consumer Action, and I'm thrilled to welcome you today. I'm happy you took time out from your day to support our work and to learn from a fantastic panel of speakers that I will introduce to you in just a moment. Also joining from Consumer Action today is Ana Flores. She is our new Executive Director. If you haven't had a chance to meet her, you will hear from her in a little bit after our speakers make their presentations, when she facilitates the question and answer session and discussion following those presentations. I do want to mention that this virtual convening is part of our annual fundraising effort, and therefore I want to thank and acknowledge our sponsors. Our presenting sponsor today is Walmart. Walmart is a longtime supporter of our work, not only for virtual events like this, but also for many of the in-person events that we've had over the years. So thank you, Walmart, for your ongoing support. We are glad you could support us this year. I want to also thank the two other sponsors of the virtual convening, and those are JP Morgan Chase & Company and Wells Fargo, who have also been strong supporters of our financial education work over many years. They've made it possible for us to bring multilingual materials to consumers across the country. Thank you to all the sponsors. And if I could get a little bit of help advancing to the next slide. I seem to have lost control here. Here we go. I am going to move right into the program today and let you know about the speakers that we have speaking today. The first thing I want to mention again is the topic of the webinar, Serving Generation Z, Post-COVID Challenges and Practical Solutions. We are fortunate to have been able to bring together the panel that you see on screen. Speaking today will be Dr. Liana Fortunato. She is the Director of Quality and Innovation at the Office of Healthcare Innovation for the American Psychological Association. Dr. Fortunato is going to talk to us about Gen Z's challenges related to mental health, the sources of stress, as well as different ways that members of this generation can cope with stress. We're very glad that you are here, Doctor. Welcome. I do want to mention just a couple of highlights from Dr. Fortunato's bio. She is interested in finding creative ways to harness technology to make high quality mental health care more accessible and equitable for all. Dr. Fortunato holds a PhD in clinical psychology from Eastern Michigan University and is licensed in Illinois and Virginia. Thank you, Dr. Fortunato, for being here. We're also going to hear today from Jordan Marlett. Jordan is going to talk to us about the way Generation Z uses technology. He's going to talk about some of their concerns around things like data privacy and online safety, and for example, the use of artificial intelligence. Do members of Generation Z think that maybe AI is going to take their job away? We'll find out in just a little bit. I'll mention just a couple of highlights from Jordan's bio, and those are that as a lead tech analyst on Morning Consult's industry intelligence team, Jordan conducts research, authors analyst notes, and advises clients on emerging technologies and trends. Jordan graduated from George Washington University with a bachelor's degree in international affairs and political science. Thank you, Jordan, for being here today. And then finally, we're going to hear from Tiffany Grant. She's an accredited financial counselor, like many of you who are attending today, and she's the host and creator of the Money Talk with Tiff podcast. Tiffany's going to talk to us about the financial challenges facing young consumers in today's economy. Many of you are financial educators and counselors, so you know what some of these issues are. We're going to dig deep today. And we're going to, one of the things she will emphasize is how important financial education is for this group. A little bit more about Tiffany. She is passionate about making financial education accessible and has been featured on CNBC, Yahoo Finance, and more. Also, she has a BS in Business Administration from the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, an MBA from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and is pursuing a PhD in social work at that same university. Thank you, Tiffany, for being here. I'm going to go ahead and advance to Dr. Fortunato, who will make her presentation. And again, if I could get a little bit of help advancing the slides to the next one. Dr. Fortunato, you should have control of the deck.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's lovely to be here with all of you today. All right, so I'm going to talk with you all about the mental health challenges that Gen Z is facing, some of their sources of stress, and some routes forward, how we might support our young people. So to start off, I want to make sure that we're all working with the same definition. So Gen Z is typically defined as individuals born from 1997 through 2012. So that makes our Gen Zers ages 11 through 26. So that's who we're going to really be focused on today. But before we take a deep dive into Gen Z, I really wanted to focus on, highlighting that people in general are struggling post-pandemic. We're seeing a lot of heightened distress and mental health concerns, and that is across many demographic groups, although Gen Z has their particular challenges. So, just to highlight some of the things that adults in general are reporting that are sources of stress for them. So this data comes from the APA does an annual Stress in America study. And so perhaps not surprisingly, you're going to see things that sound pretty familiar. People are concerned about the government and feeling like the government doesn't care about them. People are feeling like their rights are under attack. People are feeling like they're not protected by the laws in the US. Next slide, please. Additionally, people are very concerned about the economy, the price of inflation, things becoming more costly, as well as a lot of global concerns, global unrest, global uncertainty. And so there's a lot of big picture things going on that people are really struggling with. Next slide. And so one of the things that we really look at is, when does stress start to compromise functioning? Because in general, our bodies are pretty adaptive to deal with stress when it's short term. However, when stress becomes long-term, chronic, particularly intense, we start to see more profound negative effects on our well-being. And so this is a slide that really looked at when adults are starting to say they're so stressed that their functioning is compromised. And so 27% of all adults said most days they're so stressed that they can't function, which, to put that in context, that's almost 70 million Americans. And so that's of considerable concern. And then when we break that down, we see that that's actually not evenly distributed, though, amongst demographic groups. So we see that those under 35 are reporting the most challenges. And then when we further understand that, we see that there's racial differences amongst those young adults, with our Black young adults reporting the most distress. Next slide, please. So additionally, when we compare by gender, we also find that women tend to report more stress and being more impacted by their stress when compared to their male counterparts. Next slide, please. Additionally, when we look at Gen Z, so again, these are our 11 to 26-year-olds, that Gen Z, and I should highlight that this data is actually pre-pandemic. So pre-pandemic, Gen Z was much less likely than their older counterparts to report that they were in good mental health. So only 45% of Gen Zers before the pandemic are saying, yes, my mental health is excellent or very good. And as many of you know, Gen Z experienced unique challenges in the pandemic. Many experienced disruptions in schooling that were very difficult for them. Many experienced social isolation, which had negative effects. Of course, people were impacted financially, people's families, people lost jobs, people lost loved ones. And so Gen Z is coping with a host of ongoing effects from the pandemic. Next slide. And so what we know is that post-pandemic, Gen Z is really struggling. And so this data is actually current data. And so when we look at our young adults, so those 18 to 24, we find that almost a third are reporting that their mental health is poor. And about 50% of them are reporting symptoms of anxiety and depression. And then when we look at our high school students, we're seeing similar concerns. We're seeing, 57% of female students, 30% of male students reporting persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. Those are symptoms of depression. And we're also seeing really concerning stats around suicide and suicide ideation. So 30% of female students, 14% of male students reporting that they've seriously considered suicide during the pandemic. So clearly, there are really heightened needs for our young people. Next slide, please. And so when we look at particular sources of stress for Gen Z, what we find is that Gen Z has similar stresses to other demographic age groups, but Gen Z tends to be more impacted by these concerns. So concerns around work, around money, around health, they just report that they're more negatively impacted. We also see some particular concerns around mass shootings and climate change and social justice issues. And so all of these things seem to be weighing rather heavily on our Gen Zs. Next slide, please. Additionally, when we look at Gen Zs of color compared to their white peers, we find that they have some unique sources of stress. So our Gen Zs of color are much more likely to report difficulties with housing instability, hunger, food insecurity, personal debt, that those are particular sources of stress. We also know for our youth of color and our LGBTQ plus youth that the effects of discrimination and racism have profound and negative effects on their well-being. Next slide, please. So how do we understand this? What is unique about Gen Z? Well, probably a lot of things, but one of the things that has been widely researched is Gen Z's relationship with technology. And so technology is really a defining feature of Gen Z because they've had it since they have been alive. And so there's been a lot of efforts to understand the way that technology, in particular social media, may impact Gen Z's well-being. And so what we know is that everybody uses social media, but Gen Z uses it the most. So about 46% of teens are saying they are on the internet almost constantly. Almost all teens say that they use a social platform. Many of them are on it constantly. And then I think the bottom stat stuck out to me the most, that teens on average are reporting 4.8 hours of social media use per day. And it's important to note that that's an average. So there are certainly teens that are on social media much more than that. And so what's the impact of all that social media use? Well, researchers have tried very diligently to understand this. And the short version is it's complex. But research does suggest that increased social media use is associated with poorer mental health outcomes. But it doesn't seem to be so simplistic that it's not just time spent online, it's also what are people doing and what are they interacting with. Next slide, please. So when you ask Gen Z about their social media use, they will tell you that it's complex. They will tell you that there's both positive and negative effects of their social media use. Over half say they feel supported, which is great. But then we've also got a significant proportion of Gen Zers reporting that they feel judged or they feel bad about themselves. So clearly it is mixed. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that it is often mixed for an individual person, so that it's not all good or all bad, that people experience both positive and negative effects of their social media use. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting study that was done by the McKinsey Health Institute, and it's a global study of Gen Zers. And so they wanted to really look at the various ways that social media use impacts people. And so, for example, on the left, you've got self-expression, and they asked Gen Zers, how does your social media use impact your sense of self-expression? And 57% reported that it was positive, whereas 10% reported it's negative. So clearly you can see self-expression, emotional support, social connectivity, that people are reporting that it does have positive effects. But as you get more into self-esteem and certainly body image and FOMO, so fear of missing out, you start to see more mixed, more negative effects. And other research bears this out as well, that it seems to be that negative social comparison is one of the things that really leads to negative outcomes for youth online. Next slide, please. So how does Gen Z feel like they're coping with their stress? Well, what we find is that they feel kind of mixed about it. You know, some Gen Zers report that they feel like they're doing enough to manage their stress. About a quarter say that they're not. But I think this last stat stuck out to me the most, where 73% reported that they could have used more support in the past year. And that's striking to me, that if 3/4 of Gen Z is saying, yes, I need more support, one, we should listen to them, and that it raises some concerns about, okay, how do we better support them? Next slide. So the question becomes, well, what do we do? Well, we can do a lot by simply focusing on the basics, on the foundations of mental well-being. And what are the foundations of mental well-being, you might ask? Well, they're pretty similar to the physical well-being. They're things that aren't going to sound surprising to you. Next slide. So these are the real basics of emotional well-being. And I think that it's important to point out that this list isn't surprising, but we've tended to think about these things much more in terms of physical health. And we've tended historically to think about mental health as different and siloed. And what we're finding is some really interesting research around how these things really can have profound impacts on people's mental health. So for example, diet. What we find is that a diet rich in whole foods that's nutrient dense tends to promote physical health, but it also promotes mental health. Conversely, what they found is that diets that are high in ultra-processed foods, they tend to worsen mental health concerns, including depression. And so, you know, why is that of concern? Well, if you look at the average American diet, adult diet, about 60% of calories come from ultra-processed foods. And actually for our children and teens, that's even higher. And so when we think about basic things that we might encourage, that we might do to support young people, dietary changes can be a part of that puzzle. Now, I also want to acknowledge that this isn't one size fits all. And so certainly if someone is experiencing food insecurity, you know, that they may have most access to highly processed foods because that's what's available and that may be what's cost effective. And so I think this is really about thinking of these as foundational and really thinking, how do we help people optimize within their resources? And so that might mean somebody doesn't have a lot of resources to make dietary changes. And then we might focus on some of the other ones a little bit. So in terms of sleep, there's some interesting data looking at the ways in which poor sleep impacts mental health. What we know is that people who report poor sleep, which is usually defined as 6 hours or less per night, were more likely to experience mental distress. That becomes important because particularly for our teens, they require about 8 to 10 hours of sleep per night. If you ask most teens, they will tell you they may not be getting that. And oftentimes people will say social media, phone use at night, notifications, that those are some things that contribute to poor sleep. So there's a lot that can be done simply around sleep hygiene, having a set bedtime, having a set wake time, trying to get the phone out of the bedroom, or at least being on silent at night. Additionally, when we look at exercise, obviously we all know that exercise is good for our physical well-being, but there's been some really interesting research about the profound effects it can have on mental health, and they've looked at amongst adolescents. Could exercise programs help depression? And what we find is that yes, indeed it can, that increasing aerobic exercise seems to improve people's symptoms of depression. And so again, I think it's about thinking creatively about how are we encouraging our young people to be more active within what their life allows. Additionally, spending time in nature, we know that spending time in nature is actually linked to more cognitive health benefits, but also improvements in mood and mental health. Interestingly, this doesn't have to be spectacular vistas. This can be a stroll on an urban tree-lined street. It can be an urban park. There's actually some interesting evidence to suggest that even looking at photos of nature can have beneficial effects. So again, it's just being thoughtful about this connection with nature. And then lastly, fostering community. There's some really compelling data about the importance of social bonds and how having strong social bonds can reduce our risk of physical illness like heart disease, but also mental health concerns like depression. And so really strengthening people's bonds to their community and loved ones seems to have a profound protective effect. Next slide, please. Additionally, some skill building can be really important. So some of this can be setting limits. We know that setting limits on social media use does seem to help, having some time that's social media free, whether that might be dinner or bedtime or whatnot, that it's not all or nothing, but having some parameters does really seem to help. Similarly, around the consumption of news, we live in a 24/7 news cycle, and trying to limit news does seem to have some beneficial effects on well-being. Additionally, I think there's a lot of techniques that people can be taught to help them deal with their emotions. I highlighted some here. The reason I highlighted these ones is because I think that they're particularly accessible. You don't need any special equipment. They don't cost anything. They're portable in that you could do it at work, at school, on a park bench. And all of these practices really focus on calming ourselves physiologically. And we know that that has a beneficial impact on mental health. Additionally, these skills can be used preventatively. So for example, if you have a meditation practice, that might help you be resilient to stress in general, but you can also use them in times of stress. So if you've had a rough day, you've had a conflict with a friend, meditating might help calm you and make you more able to deal with that situation. And then lastly, checking in with one another and teaching people how to do that, teaching young people how to ask one another if they are okay. It is a small thing, but a profound thing. And it also normalizes that it's okay to talk about emotional well-being. Next slide, please. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that a lot of the things that I just talked about are things that we can do on an individual level. And that's really important because people want to have skills. They want to have tools to manage their well-being and help improve their well-being. But part of why we are in a mental health crisis is because of a confluence of systemic factors. And part of how we get to a better place is by addressing things systemically. And so there's a lot that could be said about this. I just chose to highlight a few things. Obviously, I know a lot of your organizations do incredibly important work in this space around addressing big picture issues like housing insecurity and food insecurity and access to healthcare. And all of that plays a role in how we support Gen Z. But additionally, I focused on some school level interventions because that's often where we have access to our young people. We know from the data that teaching emotion regulation skills from a young age is protective, that when young kids know how to regulate their big feelings, that is really helpful for them as they go through sort of the ups and downs of life. We know that fostering social connections is really important. We know that students that feel more connected to their school actually report less mental health concerns. We also know that schools that have safe spaces for LGBTQ youth, youth of color, schools that have anti-racism policies, that those students actually experience a protective effect of those programs. And so that's something that we can consider at a school-based level. We also know that early screening for anxiety and depression goes a long way, that when we can identify people who might be struggling early, it's easier to intervene. It also normalizes that mental health is part of overall health. And so if you're asking about it from a young age, it helps work on stigma and maybe makes it more likely that people will report concerns if and when they might have them. And then lastly, we don't have enough mental health professionals, and I know organizations like APA and others are working really diligently on this. And the more that we can expand the workforce and get more mental health professionals in school systems, we know that that has beneficial impacts for our young people. So lastly, here's a few resources that may be useful to you. There's the second bullet, there's some videos that go through the techniques that I discussed. The last bullet looks at some social media policies that can be potentially helpful for our young people. And then lastly, I have a reference page, which if you're interested in any of the studies that I cited with the data, you can get more information there. And with that, I will turn it over.
Thank you, Dr. Fortunato. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Apologies for the technical difficulties today. I'll go ahead and keep advancing the slides as everyone presents. Dr. Fortunato, that was a great presentation. I'm sure we will have questions for you about it at the end. Let's now move to Jordan Marlott, and I'll go to your first slide, Jordan, and just let me know when you need me to advance. And make sure to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Sounds good. And yes, that was super insightful. Thanks so much. Hey, everyone. My name is Jordan Marlott, and I'm the lead tech analyst at Morning Consult. For those who might not be as familiar with us, Morning Consult is an insights company that runs thousands of surveys every day. We're asking consumers their opinions on a very wide array of topics every day. And for this presentation, I'm really excited to share with you a slice of these insights, specifically regarding attitudes that Gen Z adults have towards tech, towards social media, but also how they feel about issues of data privacy and forward-looking technologies like artificial intelligence. And similar to the previous presentation, we're using a definition of Gen Z here but ours is for adults, so 18 to 26. So just keep that in mind. They may be in a slightly different place in their life given that. If we can move on to the next. So I believe we'll be sharing the contents of this presentation afterwards. I won't dwell on the key takeaways too long, so I think we can dive right into the next slide, please. So there are three areas of focus when it comes to Gen Z and tech that I'd like to focus on, starting kind of broad with their overall relationship with tech, with social media, how they feel about these companies, how they feel about these brands and their usership, diving into issues of data privacy as well as online safety, and then looking ahead. So next, please. Next slide. And one more. Great, thank you. So something we find consistently in our research is that Gen Z adults tend to have a less optimistic view of companies broadly relative to other generations. This is something we see reflected here when we're looking at people's attitudes towards a variety of different types of tech companies, for example. So in this question, what we're looking at on this slide is we ask people quite simply, do you have a favorable or unfavorable impression of the following? The green squares represent the share of Gen Z adults who say they're favorable towards these. So we see they're most favorable towards entertainment companies, such as streaming companies at the top. You have just over 50% share of Gen Z adults who say, yeah, I'm favorable towards these types of companies, gaming companies, online retail, electronics. But near the bottom, we find major tech companies, we find social media companies with just under half saying that they have a favorable impression towards these. I find that this is typically important context, whether we're speaking about tech or even other topics to establish, because Gen Z is, for starters, the most tech-forward generation among consumers. It's almost cliche at this point to say that, Gen Z is the first digitally native generation. They always had the internet, they always had apps, unlike, millennials or others. But they also have a very different perspective on corporate America. They have a very different perspective on companies broadly, and it shapes how they feel about a lot of these services as well as brands. Next slide. And one of the things that makes that really interesting is, despite the fact that they're not very bullish on the industries themselves, and maybe they say that they're not particularly optimistic about some of these brands or social media, that does not necessarily mean that they're not bullish on the future. So even if they tend to not have as much of a positive outlook on where things are now, and that doesn't mean that they're without hope for the future. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind, because even as we see here, something that sets this generation apart from others is 62% of Gen Z adults say that changes on social media platforms, like new security measures, more features, are headed in the right direction. That's notably more than the 53% of millennials who say the same, 44% of Gen X, and 38% of boomers. So even if there may be some trepidation about where things are, they do feel that things are headed in the right direction, at least when it comes to social media. Next slide. And that's important because, as we saw in the previous presentation, social media use is obviously very, very high among Gen Z adults, and it translates towards trust in a lot of very specific brands. So even if they're not necessarily favorable towards social media companies broadly, they do have their unique brands that they are loyal to, in a sense. And what we're looking at here is, every year, Morning Consult puts together a list of most trusted brands. And we found that relative to all US adults, Gen Z tends to place a lot more trust in brands like Snapchat, TikTok, Discord, Instagram than the average US adult does. A lot of that is rooted in their own personal experiences with these brands. They tend to be users of these platforms, much more than other folks are. And another thing that makes this particularly of interest, if we can move on to the next, is it's not just the social nature of these apps or the entertainment value that they provide. It's not just about pictures of people's dinner or memes or whatever. A sizable proportion of Gen Z adults say that they get their news from TikTok and YouTube. So Gen Z adults here in the green squares, we see that about 15% of Gen Z adults get their major news from TikTok. They're much more likely to get a similar share from YouTube, much more than other generations, and similar with Twitter or X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram too. And so these are platforms that don't just provide entertainment value or distraction value for folks. They provide real services. And this is something that is true here. We're looking at US data. In other countries, we see similar trends as well, especially apps that are much more integrated with other services, such as in China. And so if we move on to the next, I'm just going to touch on this briefly because this is sort of a look ahead in a way, in an era where a lot of these platforms that offer quote unquote free services are trying to monetize everything that they can. There's been discussion of, well, people actually willing to pay for these services. We're not really seeing that in our data right now, and particularly among Gen Z adults who, again, are the principal high frequency users of a lot of these platforms, are not ready to actually pay to use those social media platforms. And so is this something we're going to see in the near future? If we do, I don't think it's going to be particularly successful right now. Now, let's talk a bit about data privacy for a moment. On to the next slide. Great. We've been running a series of surveys on how people feel about data privacy, including Gen Z adults, including other generations. And there are some pretty interesting trends here, where if we go to the next slide, going back to this idea that Gen Z adults tend to have less rosy views of tech companies than, say, millennials or other generations, they are also less likely to give companies credit for safeguarding their data. And we ran the survey a small while ago. Something really interesting, a through line that we found, is this idea that they say, yes, my personal data should be protected. They too agree with that notion, but no, I don't really trust companies to do a very good job with it. And that's something that is fascinating because it sets them apart from, say, how millennials might think about these issues, where it's almost accepted as a given that data isn't necessarily private. Much of the time, that data is being used, in all sorts of different ways by companies, whether it's improving their services or targeting for advertisements and all that. And so there's almost this sense that, yes, I acknowledge that my data is being used in ways that maybe I wouldn't find ideal. And I don't necessarily trust companies to do a great job with it, but they still do hold them to that standard. And we see this something that's trended over time too on the next slide, where Gen Z adults are more likely to think that tech companies have a negative impact on data privacy than a positive one. And this is actually a notion that's been increasing over the past few months. We track this every single month. And so in red here, a negative impact on data privacy, in the kind of cyan color on the bottom, positive impact. And a lot of Gen Z adults do have an opinion on this. And it's something that's really big for companies to keep in mind. Because if we go to the next slide here, data privacy is not just an issue sort of at the bottom of the list of concerns or needs or wants for Gen Z adults, but also really all US consumers. Gen Z adults say that major tech companies have as negative of an impact on data privacy as they do on mental health, for example. And it's something that we see that is very important to this generation. It's a very difficult problem to solve in a way, because there are, depending on where you are, what state, what country, there are some safeguards that already exist in place. It's hard to communicate, how data is being used or how it's not. But there is this notion that tech companies are not necessarily doing enough, particularly among Gen Z. Now, let's look towards the future a little bit, if we can move on to the next. Great. So looking at future technologies, and I'm going to talk a bit about artificial intelligence specifically too. Every single month, we ask thousands of people what their levels of interest in forward-looking technologies are, ranging from self-driving cars to AI integrations to subdermal fitness tracking implants that you implant in the body, which, by the way, people are not interested in, but it helps to kind of have this control. And what we found really consistently this year is AI has cropped up to the top of this list. We're looking at data from the beginning of the year here. This has been going on throughout the year. People are very interested in using AI in search engines, AI in smart home devices, in healthcare. And it's something that we see among Gen Z adults too. We can move on to the next. But what people are interested in when it comes to AI depends also on who they are and where they are in life. So each month we're asking our respondents if they're interested in using any of 48 different applications of AI, both real and hypothetical, so ones that may exist in the near future. We see that among all US consumers, the most interesting applications are AI-powered online search, smart assistants, roadside assistants, which isn't a thing yet, but every single month people are like, yeah, I'm really interested in seeing what this is about, recipes and health diagnoses. But once we look at how that stack ranking changes among generation, we see that there are some pretty key differences where Gen Z adults aren't necessarily as interested in AI-powered online search, something that millennials, Gen X, and baby boomers are. It's AI-powered online search is sort of the flagship application of this technology this year, with Bing integrating ChatGPT, as well as Google rolling out Bard in its own search services. But for Gen Z adults, they're more interested in AI integrations in smart assistants. We find that nearly half of Gen Z adults own a smart assistant speaker in their household. We find that they're interested in AI-powered self-driving vehicles, something that we don't really see with other generations. Menus, recipes, even investment advice. So the ways that AI are going to be rolled out as integrations into services that we're using on a daily basis. At first, we're going to see this happen in online search, which we already are. Google this week has started rolling it out. In their default search engine. But how this is going to go into the future, there are going to be different needs and wants based off of this generation that is becoming a larger and larger part of the average US consumer. So next slide. Now, this is a slightly different view, kind of just hammer on this topic, but we're looking at the top 10 interesting AI applications among all US adults. And this is just to help illustrate that what's interesting to one generation might not be the same for the other. So we see that, Gen Z adults, they're much more interested in those AI-powered smart assistants, for example. They're less interested in AI-powered online search. And a lot of this just has to do, where people are. Like, for example, when we look at AI-supported health diagnoses, it's something that millennials are particularly interested in, as well as Gen Z adults, kind of entering that period where people are maybe getting off of their parents' insurance, maybe medical bills are becoming more a part of everyday life. And so as people have different issues that need addressing, depending on where they are, we're also seeing that reflected in interest in AI. Next slide. So where I'm going to end on is that even though we're seeing a good deal of interest and excitement around artificial intelligence, it's not without its concerns. And right now, what we're looking at is Gen Z adults, their levels of concern or not unconcern about AI being used in different applications or different facets of AI. And we see that the top areas of concern for Gen Z adults have to do with fraud, have to do with data privacy, have to do with harmful behavior. This is certainly something to keep an eye on as governments are racing to find out the best way to regulate applications of artificial intelligence technology. Just recently, the White House rolled out some new recommendations sort of a guide on how to regulate AI in the future. Data privacy is a very large part of it. What kind of data are models using in order to train these large language models and these AI applications? But what's really interesting to see here too is this issue of harmful behavior. And we see this repeated throughout this list, and I know it's kind of long with a small font, but we have spread of misinformation. We have the impact on electoral integrity and democracy, issues of bias and discrimination. These are really hard issues to tackle when it comes to AI, and something that we're really going to see crop up when it comes to how these tools are being used, for example, in the upcoming 2024 presidential election, and how a lot of these tools are being integrated into everyday social media. People should be concerned about how deepfakes are going to impact people's mental health or people's relationships, as well as much larger systems and things like that. And this is something that Gen Z adults they have opinions on. They do express those concerns. So definitely something to keep an eye on. A lot of interest in these types of technologies, but also a lot of problems to solve. So on to the next slide. Great. So we have all this information here. If you're curious about the methodology, again, all this information comes from our surveys that we're running every day. We have a service called Morning Consult Pro, if you're interested in checking that out. And with that, I will pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jordan, for the great presentation. And now we're going to turn to Tiffany Grant. Tiffany, I'll be advancing your slides just like we did with the others.
All right, thank you so much. Can you hear me? All right, perfect.
Great, yes.
So I want to talk about financial literacy for Gen Z. So Gen Z, they are really focused on their money, believe it or not. I teach freshmen at a local university, and anytime I say what I do, they're like, please let us know more. We want to know more. So they're thirsty for this information. So my goal is just to give you some tips, tools, tricks that you can use to educate them as best you can. So if you can go to the next slide. All right, and we won't spend too much time on this because Nelson did such a great job introducing me. But pretty much, I run Money Talk with Tiff, which is a financial education platform that includes a blog and a podcast. And next slide. All right, so some key stats and takeaways from my presentation. And some of these may be surprising to you, some not, but only 57% of young adults aged 18 to 24 are financially literate, and they base that on, according to a survey, less than 6 in 10 young adults have the ability to understand and use basic financial concepts. 24% of Gen Z could answer basic financial literacy questions. A survey found that only about 1 in 4 Gen Zers could correctly answer basic questions about personal finance. And then consequences of this include debt, instability, career issues, being financially illiterate or uneducated can lead to problems like high debt, lack of stability, and difficulty advancing professionally, which I'll get into later. So financial literacy is essential but lacking among Gen Z and honestly among all generations. But this can have severe consequences. So we need to educate young people about money management early and often. Next slide. All right, so who is Gen Z? I know the first presenter, Dr. Fortunato, kind of went over this. So Gen Z are those born from the mid 1990s to the mid 2000s. So they grew up as digital natives, as you heard before, surrounded by technology. So they're very comfortable with technology, which could have its pros and cons, which we'll get into later as well. Next slide. All right. So, what are the consequences of not having that financial education under your belt? So, debt is one of them. So, managing debt is imperative. Without educating yourself on how to use debt responsibly, it's easy to get in over your head with credit card debt, student loans, and other types of debt that are really common actually among Gen Z and millennials. Also, think about the lack of financial stability. So, typically, when you don't have that financial education under your belt, you're more likely to make decisions that are not sound financially. Maybe it might help you in the short term, but not in that long term stability. Then difficulty advancing careers. It can make it harder to negotiate salary benefits and get ahead. I don't know how many of you all have been in jobs or, evaluating different job offers and not understanding your total rewards. All of that, in my opinion, falls under financial education. Then poor credit score. So a lot of people don't realize that your credit score impacts a lot. It impacts your ability to get loans, rentals, jobs. My background's actually in HR, and that is part of, in some companies, that is part of them evaluating whether they want to hire you. They check your credit score. So it affects a lot, and even insurance rates. Inability to reach goals. So without being able to properly budget and plan your financials, it makes it harder to save for major life goals like buying a home, starting a family, things of that nature. Also, greater financial stress. So, Dr. Fortunato also talked about stress in her presentation, but financial issues are one of those main causes for stress, and that negatively impacts your mental health and well being, your physical health and well being, and relationships. Next slide. All right, so how do Gen Zers look at money? So they look at money as a way to connect and share experiences rather just as a way to earn and spend. So they're interested in using their money to cultivate meaningful relationships and memories. So going back to Dr. Fortunato's presentation, she mentioned they need a connection to community. So if you look at their view of money and you look at fintech companies like Venmo, for instance. They allow the users, if you send money, to put what you sent the money for, or to put little emojis and little things like that. And that is particularly for Gen Z and millennials. They love to use money as a community building tool and share experiences. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit also about Gen Z and investing, because this is a really hot button topic, and we might have a question about this later, but they are a tech savvy generation, which, like I said, has its pros and cons. They grew up with technology, they're very comfortable using it. So they use it to research investments, to research different financial education things, which can have its cons. If you look at TikTok, if you look at Reels, you'll see a lot of misinformation when it comes to money out there. Also, they're willing to take risks. So Gen Z is comfortable with risk taking, as evidenced by their interest in volatile assets like cryptocurrencies. There's been a huge surge in cryptocurrencies over the years, and I would say especially after or during the pandemic. A lot of people started getting interested in cryptocurrencies, which as a financial educator, I was like, oh, this is great. More people are, paying attention to their money. But on the flip side, it can have some detrimental effects if you don't know what you're doing. And so that's where that education piece comes into play. Also, Gen Z may prefer alternative investments like peer-to-peer lending or real estate over traditional stocks and bonds. I personally had seen more Gen Zers interested in things like Fundrise, which is a way to invest in real estate with small amounts of money, or things like other peer-to-peer lending services, and wanting to go that route versus looking at a traditional bank. Also, they need guidance on risks. This goes to the financial education as well. We need to teach them, or have others teach them that are trusted, the risk and rewards associated with different types of investments. So going back to the cryptocurrency point, a lot of people, even in other generations, millennials, Gen X, boomers, they didn't know what cryptocurrencies were, because this is a new technology, new to the mainstream. So where are they supposed to get that education from? And so I'll go into that a little later as well. Then also, early education is key. So starting these financial and investment conversations with Gen Z can help them make better decisions that can set them up for the long term. The earlier you can start talking to them, even if it's Gen Z or even Gen Alpha, who's coming up now, it's better to help them in the long run. And then also long-term benefits. So getting Gen Z to understand that if they can invest early, it can provide long-term benefits as they get older. Next slide. And I'm sorry, they're doing some work in the yard. Can you hear that?
No, I don't hear anything.
Okay. All right, perfect. Thank God for good mics. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Gen Z debt. So, according to a recent study, almost half of Gen Z is already in debt. So, this includes student loan debt, and this also includes credit card debt. Honestly, when I'm talking to my students, quite a few of them already have credit cards. Quite a few of them could only go to school because they being able to get student loans. That was the only way they could go to school. And so they're already coming into adulthood with debt, much like millennials as well. So this debt can impact Gen Z's ability to buy a house, car, or even get a job. And so that can lead to stress and anxiety. So it's important to teach Gen Z about budgeting, goal setting, all the different forms of debt, what these forms of debt mean, and then also investing to help them manage all of this effectively. Next slide. All right, so how do we improve financial literacy among Gen Z, and even thinking further into Gen Alpha and Gen Beta? In order to do that, I believe that school curriculum is super important. So adding personal finance classes to high school curriculum. Now, there are, of course, pros and cons to that. And so I did have a whole article that I wrote looking at the pros and cons because there are two sides to that coin, but it would be really helpful in order to get this information to the masses. A lot of times, financial education is gated, and not everybody has access to it at any given moment. And so, having it part of school curriculum could really help with that. Also, budgeting tools. So, getting Gen Z familiar, they're already a tech savvy generation, getting them familiar with free online budget calculators and money management apps. I personally went through an exercise with my little sister who just turned 18 and also my son who's 14. And I showed them just using a simple online calculator, if they put away, let's say $10 a week until they reach age 50, how much they would have. And just showing them information like that, I mean, they were amped and ready to go to save some money. And so just teaching them little things like that and showing them with the various tools available. Then also think about investing basics too. So I'm a firm believer in access to information. And so, free investing one on one classes and resources. I know I have a ton of resources on my website that are free, but these things can really help Gen Z get the basics down. So, with proper education in schools, budgeting resources, and parental guidance, we can improve financial literacy among Gen Z. It's completely doable. We just have to take the first steps. Next slide. All right. So you might be thinking, okay, Tiffany, that sounds great. But my teenager or my young adult doesn't even want to listen to me, right? We all experience that, even myself. So we have to increase engagement somehow. So these are some tips that I've used that have shown to be helpful. So one, use relatable language. Try to avoid the financial jargon and just use words that Gen Z understands. I use a lot of vernacular that Gen Z uses just so I can resonate with them. So that's one tip. If you sit here and you say, well, the compound interest of the blah, 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 you're going to automatically tune them out. But if you actually show them, like I gave the example before, of what compound interest looks like, then you can start that conversation and ease them into the vocabulary terms. Also, tell stories. So, share examples that Gen Z can relate to. I tell a ton of stories when it comes to teaching my students and also my kids about what to do and what not to do when it comes to your money. So, be honest, be open with your kids. They really appreciate that. I tell my kids stories about, times when my mom said, do you have McDonald's money? And then, as I tell those stories, I relate it back to them and how they can say, well, yeah, mommy, I do have McDonald's money, and this is how, and this is where. So tell stories to get them more involved. Then also use visuals. Like I said, infographics, memes for sure, short videos, they all appeal to the visual learners. And honestly, as social media is becoming more prevalent with the short videos, that is honestly one of the best ways I've found to connect to this demographic. Ask for feedback. So have Gen Z test your content and give input before you publish it, or have Gen Z give you feedback on, is this information helpful for you? Because sometimes we think, oh, well, I'll just teach them, this is important, so on and so forth, but we're not circling back around like, was this helpful for you? How can I make this information or this content better? And so that's another thing that's usually overlooked. Then partner with influencers. I mean, even if you look now, and I am a millennial, kind of cusping Gen Z. And so, I'm very involved with what's going on social media. And there's influencers have a lot of pull when it comes to this generation. They trust these influencers, even when, maybe they shouldn't. They trust these influencers. And so partnering with influencers to bring this education forward is super important. I joke with my kids all the time. I'm like, do I need to play video games and teach financial education? Because that's all you all watch on YouTube, right? But partnering with these people or finding creative ways to spread this information, it will be key. And then to that point, go where they are. So have a presence on platforms like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. I know I have a lot of fellow financial counselors listening. If this demographic is important to you, you have to meet them where they are. And those are and mainly short videos is what they're interested in. Next slide. All right, so I do have some financial literacy resources for Gen Z. So I have a quiz on my site, which is super fun, and even adults, everybody that takes it, they're kind of surprised by the result that they get. But create quizzes. Point them in the direction of the quiz I have on my site to test their financial education, and that way they can identify areas for improvement. So to give you an example, I may ask a question about savings. I may ask a question about credit. And if they do good with the savings part, great. Maybe you don't need to spend so much time on that. But if the credit part is lacking, maybe that's where we put our focus. So make it fun, make it interesting, don't take it too serious. Nobody wants to feel like they're in school, but also it's a great way to get a baseline on where you need to begin. And then articles and tips. So there are quite a few beginner-friendly articles and tips on budgeting, saving, and investing on my site, but also not just me. There's a ton of different content creators out there that have beginner-friendly information. And I know when it comes to my brand, I start with the beginner in mind. So even if we dive into a deep topic or a very complex topic, always start with the basics first, just to ease into that. And then also, I have a way where they can ask me questions and I answer them on the podcast. And so I can field those questions, get the answers on the podcast. And so not only do they get the answer that they need, also other Gen Zers or millennials that are listening in can get the information as well. So I do offer a lot of engaging resources to help Gen Z. My students love my podcast, but it allows them to learn about different topics in a fun and engaging way. Next slide. All right, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, panel, for your great presentations. Can I just get a sound check? You hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear
Great.
you.
And we are going to move into questions. And I'll tell you, one of the questions already come in a lot is, can we get a copy of the slides? I just want to mention that, yes, this panel created this deck so that you can use it and incorporate the material in your current education. I'm going to turn over to Anna Flores. She's going to facilitate the question and answer segment. Anna, take it away. Make sure to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Nelson, and thanks to all of the presenters for such great information. I know I've learned a lot. I didn't even realize there was such a thing as Gen Alpha and Gen Beta, so I guess we'll be doing presentations on those gens in the future. But following up on Tiffany's presentation, so earlier this week, the Better Business Bureau Institute on Marketplace Trust issued a report on how scams are targeting individuals in the 18 to 24 age group. And one of the top scams reported involved cryptocurrency and investment scams, which you referenced in your presentation, that are perpetrated online and through social media. So I'm going to direct this question to Tiffany, but the other presenters should feel to jump in as well if they have some insight to share. What advice do you have for young people to help them avoid becoming victims of investment-related scams?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. This is a good one. Unfortunately, there are a lot of scammers out there, and they want to prey on the most vulnerable of our population. So usually that's younger people or the elderly, so on and so forth. And so one rule of thumb that I have, so first of all, education, of course, but one rule of thumb that I have is I don't invest in anything I don't completely understand. And so that is what I also tell my students, and that is also what I tell my kids, is to make sure that you fully understand something before you just jump right in. Unfortunately, going back to the influencers, a lot of times these scams are perpetuated by influencers knowingly or unknowingly. And so really having them understand that they need to do their own due diligence and not really only rely on what's being said on social media. Then also, I know Jordan mentioned in his presentation that AI being used to commit fraud is a concern for Gen Z. And it's a very real concern because if you look now, there are even AI podcasts popping up where they're taking the voices of prominent people and creating scripts and things and creating whole podcasts, whole all content and stuff through AI. And so it's going to be harder and harder to differentiate who is saying what. And so that's where that educational piece comes into play. So I hope that answered that question.
Yes, thank you. Another more general question, which I'm going to throw out there and see who would like to take this one. With Gen Z entering the professional workspace, what tips and tools do you have for employers on how to support a young workforce that absolutely appears to be stressed, burned out, and scared about their future?
Yeah,
Um,
oh.
Sorry, I can go just real quick. So this is based off of some other research that we've conducted. But one of the consistent trends that we see when surveying Gen Z adults is how purpose-driven they are when it comes to what they're looking for in terms of their work, in terms of their employer. Issues that are related to, for example, the environment or social justice. Governance, ESG, essentially tend to be a lot more important for Gen Z adults than they are for other generations, and they tend to look for a lot more kind of purpose in what they're doing, and not just the paycheck. Like obviously that's still important, the benefits are still important, things like that. But they are looking to contribute to something that is larger to themselves. Is something that we see. So I think when it comes to communicating to Gen Z entering the workforce, it's not just about the money, it's not just about the benefits, even though all that definitely helps, especially in an era with a lot of debt and things like that. But it's also what is that company doing to either contribute to society, make things better. What kind of programs do they have in house that might be appealing? And what we see too is just a lot of desire for flexibility. So things like remote work and flexible hours and things like that. So there are certainly some different kind of like needs and wants that we see among Gen Z adults when it comes to the workforce. And also, the other thing I'll mention too that is more related to tech is we did do a survey recently among tech workers, asking them, among which many are young, what they're interested in working on, and AI kind of comes up to the top there. So if there's a way to loop in forward-looking technologies, things that are exciting into the purpose of the organization or the roadmap of an organization's product or service, that's something that is enticing to talent that's in high demand.
Thanks, Jordan. I think Dr. Fortunato had something to add as well.
Well, I would echo what Jordan has said, and I know when we think about burnout, that one of the things that is protective is value-driven work, purpose-driven work, and so certainly that is, I think, true for everybody, but particularly true for Gen Z. We also a lot about flexibility. When employees are treated well, they often are happier and thrive. And so flexibility allows, the recognition that people have other things in their life, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't working hard, but the hours might need to look a bit different. And then we also know that actually people are pretty interested in wellness benefits. So what does your company or your organization offer to support my needs? And not just physical health, mental health, preventative care. So that's something that comes up as well.
And I just want to tag on to that as well, all of these points. And financial wellness is important. I wrote an article on why it's beneficial for employees, but also employers. Uh, People want to feel like you care. That's pretty much the bottom line. And if financial stress is one of the main stressors, then having those financial wellness benefits or financial education or what have you can really be helpful for the employees and get them to stick around.
Great, thank you. And so my next question I'm going to direct to Dr. Fortunato. So in your presentation, you talked about how 73% reported that they could have used more support. And this is what Gen Z reported. They could have used more support. Did they go on then to give examples of what they consider support? What kind of support are they looking for?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, I think the way that that study was conducted, I don't know that there was a follow-up question about what would have been helpful. But I think that, creating opportunities for connection, creating opportunities to check in with one another, I think that ultimately conversation is sort of the starting point, that having someone, a trusted adult, a trusted friend, sort of check in on one another and just sort of say, how are you doing? And that it's okay to say, I'm not doing that well, or I'm struggling. I think that, again, sometimes it's not one size fits all about what people need, but it is creating a safe space where it's okay to say, hey, I'm struggling and this is what I might need. Or even, I don't know what I need, but I know I'm struggling. And can you help me figure it out? And I think creating more safe spaces where young people can go, trusted adults, trusted organizations, where that conversation can start. I think then it's about directing people based on their needs. But I think it's in many ways fostering more proactive conversations about how are we all doing, particularly coming out of a pandemic. And there's a lot of data about the collective trauma that our society and our world is dealing with, and perhaps not dealing with all that well. And so I think it starts with, how do you create space to say, hey, we're not all okay all the time. How are you doing?
Great, thank you. Going to direct this next question to Jordan, and we talked about AI and how Gen Z is concerned about fraud, data privacy. Do you have any information or do any research on? So then, who does Gen Z feel is responsible for protecting them from fraud and protecting their privacy? Is that a role of the government, or is that the role of industry, or some sort of combination?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we've been conducting, a good amount of research into, the idea of like regulation of AI, how it should be regulated, who should be regulating it, and so far what we have found is that the entity that people say should be regulating AI is the companies that are developing the models themselves, and I'm going to caveat that by saying it's not a resounding, oh, I really trust these AI companies to self-regulate. It's actually more of an issue that there's that trust in government has bottomed out. That there's not a lot of trust in the current Congress to effectively pass laws that will effectively regulate AI. Obviously there's a lot of gridlock that's going on, which is probably an understatement. And so right now, what we find is that most consumers, this includes Gen Z as well, say that companies that develop AI should be self-regulating. Now, what I'll also say is that it's still really early days when it comes to AI, or the way that we're talking about AI, generative AI largely. If we think about it, most of these products that exist in this space are still very much in beta. There's no, version 1.0 of these things. They're still being figured out. They're still in very active development. They're still in testing. And so it's very much a moving target for regulators to say, this is how it should be integrated into these different services or products. This is how, these models should be trained, because that's changing every single week. And so, right now the EU is obviously at the forefront when it comes to regulating AI. They're sort of setting this roadmap for maybe how a lot of other governments would do it. But first of all, until we have a better sense of what generative AI can or can't do, we're not going to have a very good sense of how to most effectively regulate it. So it's a bit of a wishy-washy answer. Sorry, but the TLDR is that, right now what we see is that consumers expect AI development companies to self-regulate.
Thanks for that. And so this next question I'm going to direct to Tiffany. So you talked about student debt. And so we have a question about, do college institutions review with the students what their payments are going to be when they actually take on the loan? Or do they find that out sort of post-graduation? Do they have the information that they need to make the decision on whether to take on the debt when they're actually signing the paperwork?
Yes, excellent question. And I have experience with this actually as a student now. And so, really, there's no one sitting down saying, okay, this is what's going to happen after you graduate, so on and so forth. Now, they do have to go through like an online version. It's called a master promissory note, where they have to go in and click a few buttons, and get through. And so I say it in that way because that's probably what most students are doing, are just trying to click through because they're like, I need these student loans. So let me just do what they need me to do so I can move on. So there's no one that physically sits down and tells them that. It's all an online process. And that's where, us as educators or parents or what have you can come in and really get them to understand or try to explain to them how it really works. Because like I said, it's only a click through, and you don't even have to actually read it, honestly. You can just click through. So
good to know. Thank you. Let's see, we have another question related to long COVID. And I'm going to direct this to Dr. Fortunato. How can individuals with long COVID get needed support? Are there any resources available for this particular group, including peer support? And I don't know, asking this question, really not having a lot of background on what percentage of individuals in Gen Z are affected by long COVID.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's a great question, and I think we're only really starting to understand the impact of long COVID, certainly from a mental health standpoint. And the supports, I think, are going to vary by location. I think that part of it may be looking locally about what is available, or starting with healthcare organizations. Oftentimes, health organizations do offer support groups for different kinds of concerns, so like cancer support groups, etc. And some of them may offer long COVID support groups, but that may, I think the short version, unfortunately, is I don't know that there's a super widespread and super robust support network. That said, depending on the community, there may be resources. Additionally, and reaching out to a mental health professional, that one-on-one work could help someone tailor supports to their particular needs. But unfortunately, this is probably an area where more could be done.
Great, thank you. And this question is also for Dr. Fortunato related to the study. I believe you mentioned when you talked about the age range, you talked about starting at age 11. Were there actually people age 11 that participated in this study?
I'm not entirely sure which study is being referenced. We did, because I presented data from several different studies, but a lot of the studies are, the APA Stress in America studies are 18 and up, so they don't include minors. Where some of the data that comes from CDC around the high school students, those are teens. But if somebody has a more specific question, I'm happy to tailor it.
Okay, great, thank you. And so this is a general question. So many of the participants today represent community-based organizations and financial educators, and was wondering from the panel what tips, best practices you might be able to share to talk about how we can better, as community groups, reach out directly to this population, given that they're so focused on social media and online. How do we as community organizations do a better job reaching these Gen Zers?
Yeah, so I guess I can kick that off. Social media, it's pretty much inevitable. You're going to have to use it in one way or another. So whether that looks like your organization or a company doing it directly or partnering with, for example, someone like me that's constantly on it anyway, to get your information out there as well. But that is the place that you will find most Gen Zers when it comes to content. And then looking at social media, also getting into video is super important, just from my perspective. Having that content out there in an entertainment way, because I've also learned that they just don't want just education. It has to be a little entertaining. And so getting that information out in that way as well is a great way to connect. Also meeting them where they are. So local universities, local community colleges, looking at young people groups that are already established, maybe junior achievement, things of that nature. You can also get your word out as well.
Do any of our other presenters have anything to add to that?
The only thing that I might add, in addition to what Tiffany said, is depending on the type of services or supports that your organization is trying to target to Gen Z, you might just ask them. That often that's where we start, is we sort of formally, we often call it a needs assessment, but just sort of whatever group you're trying to understand or support, sort of going to them or some of them and sort of saying, like, how might we best support you, or what would you like to know about this topic, or what would be compelling to you? We find that people will tell you, so you don't necessarily have to take the responsibility for having all the answers. Sometimes it's just starting that outreach and really finding out what Gen Z wants. They'll tell you.
Great, thanks. Another question directed at Tiffany. Do you find any differences in the questions or concerns raised by young women versus young men in in financial education?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Thank you for that. So I will say, and let me just think on that for just a moment, because I will honestly, the common thread is budgeting, that I'm getting from Gen Z. Budgeting, how to manage their money, how to make more money is important to them. And I would say with women, female, Gen Z, they're also interested in how to, I guess, play the game, if that makes sense. So how can they navigate these, corporate spaces or business spaces or whatever, whatever it is they're in. But other than that, I would say the questions are pretty similar between the two genders. They're really interested in how to manage their money, make more money, and invest it.
Great, thank you. I'm going to thank everyone for their great answers, and I'm going to toss it back to Nelson.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, speakers, for bearing with us with all the questions. And we may have more. Please submit questions to us by email. We'll try to get you some answers. I just want to mention that we are continuing the celebration of service tonight in DC. If someone is still in the area, you can join us for the reception. This is part of our 52nd anniversary. We will be honoring those who have done great service, including our recently retired executive director. I also want to mention again that this is a fundraiser. This is part of our fundraising effort, so I don't want anyone to feel left out. Anyone is welcome to contribute to Consumer Action at any time. Here's some information here. You'll see it when you get the slide deck, and you can always just go to our website and hit the Support Us button. Another way to support us, speaking of video and social media, is that we do have a YouTube channel. If you are able to subscribe to our YouTube channel, that is also helpful. Thanks very much to all the panelists and the speakers, to the panelists and to Anna for helping with those questions. Stand by for a quick post-webinar survey. I will end the webinar now and see you next time. Thanks very much, everyone.